daily bread in the ancient and medieval world, and more. Good evening and welcome. Tonight we're exploring something so ordinary, so unremarkable, that it defined human existence for thousands of years without anyone thinking twice about it. Not the great battles or the crowning of kings, but bread. Simple bread. The kind you ate yesterday and the kind you'll eat tomorrow. The kind that structured every single day for most people who have ever lived. This isn't a story of innovation or excitement. It's a story of repetition, of doing the same thing, in the same way, day after day after day. For most of human history, bread wasn't a choice. It was simply there. Background noise. The thing that kept you alive. Let's settle in and talk about the most boring, essential food in the ancient and medieval world. Bread as everyday survival. Imagine waking up knowing exactly what you'll eat today, and tomorrow, and the day after that. Not because you've planned it, but because there is no other option. For thousands of years, from the dusty banks of Nile to the rainy fields of medieval England, bread was that certainty. It wasn't cuisine. It wasn't celebrated. It was simply fuel. When we look back at ancient Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, and Rome, and forward to the Middle Ages, we find bread at the center of everything, but not in the way we might imagine. There were no artisan bakeries with clever names, no sourdough workshops or baking competitions. There was just bread, coarse bread, dark bread, often stale bread, bread that tasted of work and waiting. The ancient Greeks had a telling way of thinking about meals. Everything that wasn't bread they called opsin, which translates roughly to condiment or accompaniment. Think about that. The meat, the vegetables, the cheese, the olives, all of it was just bread's companion. Bread was a meal. Everything else was optional decoration. In ancient Egypt, workers were paid in bread and beer, not as a supplement to their wages, but as the wages themselves. 2 loaves and a jug, day after day. The pyramids weren't built by men dreaming of gold. They were built by men eating their daily ration of barley bread, washing it down with thick, nutritious beer, and returning to the quarry the next morning to do it all again. This was bread as pure survival. No one woke up excited about it. No one wrote poems praising its delicate crumb structure. You ate it because if you didn't eat it, you would die. Medieval peasants understood this intimately. Chronicles from the 13th and 14th centuries mention bread constantly, but only in passing, the way we might mention breathing. Of course they ate bread. What else would they eat? A farming family in England might consume 2 pounds of bread per person per day. That's roughly an entire modern loaf. Every single day. For everyone. Children, adults, elderly. 2 pounds of dense, heavy, filling bread. And if the harvest failed, if the rains came too early or too late, if the Lord's mill broke down or the grain spoiled in storage, that bread disappeared. And with it, the thin margin between survival and starvation collapsed. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Before there was bread on the table, there was grain in the field. And before grain could become bread, it had to be planted, tended, harvested, dried, stored, and ground. Each step took time. Not hours. Months. An entire year's worth of labor for bread that would be gone in days. Grain before bread. The rhythm of bread began in the earth. Long before anyone ground flour or lit an oven, someone had to plant seeds and wait. This waiting was not optional. It was a foundation of every loaf. In ancient Mesopotamia, along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, farmers planted barley and emmer wheat. These were the grains of the Fertile Crescent, the plants that made civilization possible. But the process was slow, painfully necessarily slow. First, the fields had to be prepared. In early spring, or sometimes in autumn for winter crops, farmers would break the earth. In the earliest times, this meant using a simple wooden stick, sharpened and weighted, dragged through the soil. Later, a wooden plow pulled by oxen. The goal was to turn the soil, to expose the darker, richer earth underneath and break up a hard crust on top. This was hot, dusty work. The kind that made your back ache and your hands crack. The kind that had to be done whether you felt like it or not, because if the field wasn't plowed, there would be no grain. And if there was no grain, there would be no bread. After plowing came seeding. In most places, this was done by hand. A farmer would walk the length of the field with a bag of seeds, reaching in with a rhythm, scattering the grain in sweeping arcs. Not measured, not counted, just scattered, based on experience and hope. Some seeds would land in good soil. Some would be eaten by birds. Some would simply fail to sprout. This was expected. This was normal. And then came the waiting. Medieval farmers knew this waiting intimately. After the seeds were in the ground, there was nothing to do but watch and hope. Hope for rain, but not too much rain. Hope for sun, but not scorching sun. Hope that frost wouldn't come too early in spring or linger too late. If you planted wheat in October or November, as many medieval farmers did, you wouldn't see a harvest until following August. 10 months, nearly a year from seed to grain. And during those 10 months, the crop was vulnerable. Too much rain and the seeds would rot. Too little and they'd wither. A late frost could kill young shoots. Diseases could spread through the field. Animals could trample or eat the growing grain. There was very little a farmer could do except wait and watch and perform the small tasks available. Weeding mostly. Pulling up the unwanted plants that competed with the wheat or barley. This was tedious work, often done by women and children, moving slowly through the rows on hands and knees, identifying the wheat from the weeds, pulling one and leaving the other. In ancient Egypt, the rhythm was slightly different but no less defined by waiting. The Nile flooded every year, depositing rich, dark silt across the fields. Farmers would wait for the water to recede, then plant their seeds in the damp soil. Then more waiting. Waiting for the shoots to appear. Waiting for them to grow tall. Waiting for the heads of grain to swell and ripen. The Egyptians grew emmer wheat primarily, along with barley. Emmer is an ancient grain, harder than modern wheat, with a tough outer hull. It required more work to process, but it grew reliably in the Nile Valley's conditions. Farmers didn't choose emmer because they preferred it. They grew it because it worked. By July or August, if everything had gone right, the grain would be ready, the stalks would be golden, the heads heavy, the kernels hard. This was harvest time, and it changed everything. Suddenly, the slow pace of waiting exploded into frantic activity. Harvest in the ancient and medieval world was urgent. Once the grain was ripe, it had to be cut quickly. If you waited too long, the kernels would fall from the heads and be lost in the field. If rain came, the grain could mold or rot. If wind knocked the stalks down, they'd be harder to harvest. Every day mattered. In medieval England, harvest time meant everyone worked. Men, women, children, the elderly. Lords would often provide extra food and ale during harvest because they needed every available person in the fields. The work began at dawn and continued until dark. Using sickles or scythes, workers would cut the grain stalks close to the ground, then gather them into bundles called sheaves. These sheaves would be tied and stood upright in the field to dry. A team of 5 people could harvest about 2 acres per day. That might sound like a lot. But remember, a single village might have hundreds of acres to harvest, and it all had to be done quickly, within a few weeks at most. Once cut and dried, the grain had to be gathered and stored. In ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt, farmers would transport the sheaves to storage buildings or pits. In medieval Europe, grain went into barns, where it would be kept for threshing. Threshing was the process of separating the edible grain from the inedible parts, the stalk, the chaff, and the hull. In its simplest form, this meant beating the sheaves with sticks or having animals walk over them, crushing the stalks and loosening the kernels. Then came winnowing, where workers would toss the mixture into the air, letting the wind carry away the lighter chaff while the heavier grain fell back down. This work happened throughout the autumn and winter. It was indoor work, done in barns or covered areas, and it was tedious. Hours and hours of beating, tossing, separating, all to produce grain that would eventually become flour, that would eventually become bread. But we're getting ahead of ourselves again. Before grain became bread, it had to become flour, and that meant grinding. Long, slow, repetitive grinding by hand. If you want to understand the daily reality of ancient and medieval life, spend a few hours grinding grain by hand. Actually, spend several hours, because that's how long it would take to produce enough flour for a family's bread. The tool for this work was called a quern. In its most basic form, a quern consisted of 2 stones. The bottom stone, called a saddle quern, was stationary. It was usually concave, worn into a smooth depression by years of use. The top stone, called the muller or hand stone, was smaller, often shaped like a loaf of bread itself, meant to be gripped with both hands. To use a saddle quern, you would kneel on the ground, place a handful of grain on the bottom stone, and then push the top stone forward and pull it back, crushing the grain between the 2 stones. Forward and back, over and over and over. This was not fast. This was not easy. Scholars estimate that 2 women, working together with a saddle quern, could grind about 10 pounds of flour in an hour. That's working continuously, with the rhythm and motion of people who've done this countless times before. For a family that needed 20 pounds of flour a day, that meant 4 hours of grinding. every single day. In ancient Egypt, grinding grain was women's work. Archaeological evidence shows this clearly. Wooden models from Egyptian tombs depict women kneeling at querns, their bodies bent forward, their hands gripping the muller. This posture was hard on the body. Studies of ancient Egyptian skeletons show consistent were patterns in the knees, lower back, and shoulders. The physical cost of thousands of hours spent grinding grain. The sound of grinding would have been a constant backdrop in any ancient settlement, a rhythmic, scraping sound, stone on stone. The same sound in Egypt, in Mesopotamia, in the Indus Valley, in Neolithic Europe. Wherever people ate grain, someone was grinding it. Around the 4th or 3rd century BCE, someone invented a better solution, the rotary quern. Instead of pushing and pulling, you could rotate the top stone in a circle over the bottom stone. This was more efficient. The top stone was heavier, which helped with the grinding, and it had a hole in the center where grain could be fed in continuously. As the stone turned, grain fell for the hole, was ground between the stones, and emerged as flour at the edges. A rotary quern could be operated by one person, using a wooden handle set into the side of the upper stone. The motion was still repetitive. Turning, turning, always turning, but it was somewhat easier on the body than the back and forth of the saddle quern. Still, grinding remained tedious. You couldn't rush it. The stones had to make countless rotations to break down the hard kernels into something fine enough to use for bread. And the flour that emerged wasn't white and powdery, like modern flour. It was coarse, gritty, and often contained small fragments of stone that had chipped off the quern itself. Bread made from this flour wore down teeth. Archaeological examinations of ancient skulls often show severe tooth, where the result of a lifetime of eating bread that was effectively mixed with sand. Medieval peasants faced the same grinding reality. In the early Middle Ages, most households had their own quern, hidden away in a corner of their one-room dwelling. Women would grind grain as needed, sometimes every day, sometimes every few days if they baked larger batches. But by the 13th century, things had changed. Feudal lords realized that milling grain was a service they could control and tax. Lords built watermills and windmills, large stone structures where grain could be ground much more efficiently than by hand. These mills used the same principle as a quern. Two stones grinding against each other, but the stones were much larger and were turned by water wheels or wind sails instead of human muscle. The catch was that peasants were required to use the lord's mill. In many places, it became illegal to own a quern. Lords would send men to search cottages and destroy any hand mills they found. Why? Because if people could grind their own grain, they wouldn't pay the mill tax. And that tax was significant, often a tenth or more of the flour produced. Some peasants hid their querns, using them in secret, but most accepted the new system. They would take their grain to the mill, wait their turn, and pay the miller his fee. It was easier than grinding by hand, certainly, but it was also another layer of dependence, another way that daily bread required negotiating with power structures beyond your control. Whether by hand or by mill, though, the end result was the same: flour. Coarse, heavy, sometimes gritty flour. And with that flour, finally you could make simple dough, simple tools. The recipe for bread, in its most basic form, has remained unchanged for thousands of years. Flour, water, time. That's it. Everything else is optional. In ancient Mesopotamia, a woman making bread might use barley flour, the most common grain in the region. She would take a bowl, add the flour, and slowly work in water until the mixture formed a dough. No measurements, no recipes written down, just experience. The dough should feel right. Not too sticky, not too dry. If she had access to salt, she might add a pinch. Salt improved the flavor and helped the dough hold together. But salt was often expensive, and many breads were made without it. The question of leavening is more complicated. For much of human history, bread was unleavened, flat, dense, made from dough that was mixed and immediately cooked. This was the simplest form of bread. Flatbreads cooked on hot stones or in the ashes of fire. But sometime, probably around 6000 BC in Egypt, someone discovered that if you left dough sitting out for a while before cooking it, it would rise. Bubbles would form. It would puff up. The resulting bread was lighter, airier, easier to eat. We now know this was caused by wild yeast in the air and in the flour itself. These microorganisms feed on the sugars in the dough, producing carbon dioxide gas as a byproduct. The gas forms bubbles, and the dough rises. But ancient bakers didn't know about microorganisms. They just knew that dough that sat for a while made better bread. The most common way to ensure rising was to save a piece of dough from each baking and add it to the next batch. This starter contained a culture of yeast and bacteria that would leaven the new dough. We call this sourdough now, and it was a standard method of making leavened bread for thousands of years. In ancient Egypt, bakers also discovered that the foam from beer brewing, called barm, could be used to leaven bread. Beer brewing was common in Egypt, and the frothy layer that formed on top of fermenting beer was full of active yeast. Mix it into bread dough, and the dough would rise reliably. In medieval Europe, the same methods persisted. Most bread was leavened with either sourdough starter or beer barm. A housewife or baker would keep a pot of starter, feeding it with fresh flour and water every few days to keep the yeast alive. When it was time to make bread, a portion of this starter would be mixed into the new dough. The kneading process was simple but physical. You would turn the dough out onto a surface, a wooden board or a stone slab, and work it with your hands, pushing away, folding it back, turning it, pushing again. This developed the gluten in the flour, giving the bread structure. It was rhythmic work, meditative, almost if you'd done it 1,000 times. Once kneaded, the dough would be left to rise. In a warm house, this might take a few hours. In a cold house, much longer. You couldn't rush it. You just had to wait until the dough had roughly doubled in size, puffed up with gas from the yeast. Then came shaping. Most breads were formed into simple rounds, balls of dough slightly flattened. No fancy scoring or decorative patterns. Those were for later centuries, for bakers who had time and skill to spare. For most of history, bread was shaped with minimal fuss and maximum efficiency. The tools were minimal: a bowl for mixing, a board for kneading, your hands for shaping. That was usually it. Some medieval bakers had wooden paddles, called peels, for moving bread in and out of ovens. But many households made do with much less. The simplicity was both a blessing and a limitation. Anyone could make bread. You didn't need special equipment or rare ingredients. But you also couldn't easily improve on the basic method. Bread was what it was, a mixture of flour and water, risen or not, baked until solid. And speaking of baking, that was often the most complicated part of the entire process. Baking without ovens. If you ask someone today where bread is baked, they'll point to their oven. A box with controlled heat, a thermostat, a timer. It seems obvious. But for most of human history, most people didn't have ovens. They had to be more creative. The earliest bread was probably cooked on hot stones. Imagine a flat rock, placed in or near a fire until it's thoroughly heated. You place your flattened dough directly on the stone, and the heat cooks the bottom. Turn it over, cook the other side. The result is flat bread, quick to make, quick to eat, and requiring no special equipment. This method was used everywhere, from the Natufian camps in Jordan 14,000 years ago to medieval cottages in Ireland. The technique varied slightly. Sometimes a stone was laid over fire, sometimes buried in ashes, sometimes propped up at an angle, but the principle remained the same. Hot stone, flat dough, cooked bread. The ancient Egyptians developed a more sophisticated system. They made clay bread molds, shaped like tall cones. The bread dough would be pressed against the inside of the cone, and then the cone would be placed in or near fire. The clay held heat well, cooking the bread evenly. These cone breads were one of the distinctive styles of ancient Egypt, shown in hieroglyphs and found preserved in tombs. For leavened bread, which needed more even heat to rise properly while baking, people built simple dome ovens. These were essentially large clay domes with fire built inside. You would build a hot fire, let it burn down the coals, then rake out most of the coals, leaving just a residual heat. Then you'd place your loaves inside the dome, seal the opening, and let them bake in the captured heat. This method worked, but it required skill. Too hot, and the outside would burn while the inside stayed raw. Too cool, and the bread wouldn't cook through. You had to judge the temperature by feel and experience. Some bakers would test the heat by throwing a handful of flour inside. If it browned quickly, the oven was ready. In medieval Europe, the hearth was the center of most homes. This was a flat area, usually in the middle of the room, where the fire was built. Cooking, heating, and lighting all came from this one fire. To bake bread on a hearth, some households used an upturned pot. They would place the shaped loaf on the hot hearthstones, cover with a large clay or metal pot, and then heap hot coals over and around the pot. This created a small oven environment, trapping heat around the bread. But the more common solution, especially in villages and towns, was the communal oven. These were large, permanent structures built of stone and clay, capable of holding dozens of loaves at once. In medieval France, these were called fours bonneaux, and they were often owned by the feudal lord. The system worked like this. Once a week, or sometimes more frequently in larger communities, the oven would be fired up. This was a big operation. First, a large fire would be built inside the oven and allowed to burn for several hours until the stones were thoroughly heated. Then the coals would be raked out, the oven floor swept clean, and the baking would begin. Families would prepare their dough at home, shape it into loaves, and mark each loaf with a distinctive cut or pattern, their family signature. Then they would carry their loaves to the communal oven. The baker or oven keeper would arrange all the loaves inside using a long wooden peel, close the door, and let them bake in the residual heat. This system had advantages. A large oven held heat longer and more evenly than a small hearth. It was more efficient, one large fire baking bread for 20 families rather than 20 small fires baking for one, and it reduced the fire hazard. A mismanaged fire in a thatched cottage could burn down half a village. A stone oven, standing apart, was much safer, but it also had disadvantages. You baked when the oven was fired, not when you wanted fresh bread. This usually meant once a week. For the 6 other days, you ate stale bread. You also had to pay for the privilege. The oven keeper, or the lord who owned the oven, charged a fee. Sometimes this was a portion of the flour or bread itself. Sometimes it was paid in coin. Either way, it was a tax on your daily sustenance. Some regions resisted the system. In parts of Scotland and Ireland, households continued using their own querns and baking on their own hearths well into the modern era. They valued independence over convenience. But in most of medieval Europe, the communal oven was simply how things worked. The bread that came out of these ovens was not uniform. Some loaves baked faster than others, depending on their position in the oven. Some burned, some stayed pale. The crust was thick and hard, the interior dense. This wasn't a failure of technique. This was simply what bread was like when you baked with fire in stone ovens and coarse ground flour. Types of bread people actually ate. When we imagine historical bread, we might picture rustic loaves with crackling crusts or maybe golden braided challah or artisanal sourdough. But most bread, for most people, looked nothing like this. Let's start with the grain. In the ancient world, barley was far more common than wheat. Barley grows in poorer soil, tolerates drought better, and produces a reliable crop. For these reasons, it was a grain of common people throughout Mesopotamia, Greece, and Rome. Barley bread is dense and heavy. It doesn't rise well because barley has very little gluten, the protein that gives wheat bread its structure and airiness. So barley bread was typically flat or only slightly risen, and it had a strong, slightly bitter taste. This was everyday bread, the bread of farmers and laborers. The bread you ate because that's what you had. Wheat was better. Wheat has more gluten, which means it can rise higher and create a lighter texture. In ancient Egypt, emmer wheat was a standard. In medieval Europe, common wheat became dominant, but wheat was also more finicky. It needed better soil, more careful cultivation. It was more expensive. This created a hierarchy. Wealthy people ate wheat bread. Poor people ate barley bread or rye bread or oat bread, whatever grain was cheapest and most available in their region. In medieval England, this hierarchy was explicit. The finest bread was called pandemain or wastel. This was made from white wheat flour, sifted multiple times to remove all the bran and impurities. It was light, relatively soft, and eaten by nobles and wealthy merchants. Below that was cocket, a harder wheat bread that was less refined. Then cheat, a whole wheat bread with the bran left in. Then turut, or brown bread, which might include wheat mixed with barley or rye. At the bottom was horse bread. Despite the name, people ate this too. It was made from whatever was available: beans, peas, barley, oats, sometimes acorns. In times of famine, when grain stocks ran low, people added anything they could to stretch the flour. The resulting bread was coarse, dark, hard to digest, and often tasted bitter or earthy. In medieval France, most people ate maslin, which was bread made from wheat and rye grown together in the same field and ground together. This was practical. The two grains supported each other in the field, and mixing them in bread made use of what you had. Rye bread was common in northern Europe, particularly in regions where wheat struggled. Rye tolerates cold, wet conditions. It produces a dark flour that makes dense, sour bread. If you've ever had German pumpernickel, you have some sense of what rye bread was like. Heavy, filling, with a distinctive tangy flavor. Oat bread was eaten in Scotland, northern England, and parts of Ireland. Oats don't form gluten, so oat bread can't rise like wheat bread. Instead, It was made as flat oat cakes, cooked on a hot stone or griddle. These were dry, somewhat bland, but filling. The texture of most medieval bread was far from soft. The coarse flour created a rough, heavy crumb. If the bread was a week old, and remember, most households baked weekly, it would be rock hard. People would soak it in soup or stew to soften it. They would dip in water or milk or ale. Hard bread wasn't seen as bad bread. It was just bread. One distinctive use of stale bread was the trencher. This was a thick slice of bread, often several days old, used as a plate. You would place your food on top of the trencher, meat, vegetables, sauce, and eat from it. The bread would soak up juices and grease. At the end of the meal, you could eat the trencher too, now soft and flavored. Or, if you were wealthy, you might give the used trenchers to the poor or feed them to dogs. The idea that bread should be soft and fresh is relatively modern. For most of history, bread was expected to last. It was baked in large batches precisely because it would keep. Hard bread was harder to spoil. And since most medieval bread was made with sourdough fermentation, it had natural preservatives. The acids produced by the bacteria made it less prone to mold. Color varied widely. Wheat bread could be anything from pale tan to brown, depending on how much bran was included. Barley bread was grayish. Rye bread was dark brown. And many breads were mixed grain, producing unpredictable colors. There was no standardization. Every batch looked a bit different. Taste also varied. Fresh wheat bread had a mild, slightly sweet flavor. Barley bread was more bitter. Rye bread was sour. Bread made with old or moldy grain, which happened, tasted musty and could make people sick. Bread contaminated with ergot, a fungus that grows on rye, caused hallucinations and could be fatal. But most days, most bread tasted like what was grain, water, a bit of salt if you were lucky. It wasn't meant to be exciting. It was meant to fill your stomach and give you enough energy to work until the next meal. Bread across social classes. We've already touched on this, but it's worth emphasizing. Bread was the great constant across medieval society, even as the quality varied dramatically. A king ate bread. A bishop ate bread. A knight ate bread. A merchant ate bread. A farmer ate bread. A serf ate bread. Everyone, at every level of society, ate bread with every meal. But the bread they ate was very different. The king ate pandemain, the whitest, finest bread available. It was made from wheat that had been carefully sifted, sometimes multiple times, to remove every trace of bran. The result was flour that was almost as white as modern flour. Baked fresh daily by skilled bakers, this bread was soft, light, and had a delicate texture. A wealthy merchant might eat wastel or fine manchet, still white bread, but perhaps not quite as refined as a king's. Still, it was far superior to what most people ate. A yeoman farmer or craftsman might eat cocket or cheat, wheat bread, but with more of the bran included, coarser, darker, but still recognizably wheat. A peasant, particularly a poor peasant or a serf, ate true horse bread or barley bread, dark, heavy, filling but coarse. This was bread that made your jaw ache to chew when it was fresh, and that required soaking when it was stale. This hierarchy wasn't just about taste or preference. It was about cost. Fine white bread required more labor to produce. The wheat had to be good quality. The flour had to be sifted repeatedly, which was time-consuming and wasteful. Much of the nutritious part of the grain was thrown away in the process. Fine bread used more expensive ingredients, like salt and sometimes butter or milk. But it was also about symbolism. White bread was a status symbol. To eat white bread was to demonstrate that you had the resources to waste, because that's what refining flour was, in a sense, waste. You were discarding the parts of grain that contained the most nutrition to achieve a color and texture that signified wealth. Medieval physicians recommended white bread as the healthiest option. They believed that white bread was easier to digest and more nourishing than dark bread. They were wrong, of course. Whole grain bread is far more nutritious, but their recommendations reinforced the social hierarchy. Rich people ate healthy white bread. Poor people ate inferior dark bread. What's fascinating is that despite these differences, the underlying pattern was the same. Rich and poor alike structured their days around bread. Bread with breakfast, bread with the midday meal, bread with supper. Bread was the base, the foundation, the thing you could count on. When times were good, a wealthy household might have white bread, several types of meat, fish, vegetables, fruit, cheese, and wine. But the bread was still there, still central. When times were bad, a poor household might have nothing but bread and water, but the bread was still there. This universality meant that bread was more than food. It was a social marker, a political tool, a religious symbol, and a measure of the seasons and the harvest. The word companion comes from Latin roots meaning with bread, someone you break bread with. The word Lord in Old English derives from hlafword, meaning loaf guardian, the person who controlled the bread supply. Lady comes from hlefdige, loaf maker. Bread structured language as much as it structured meals. And bread, in all its varieties, was a timekeeper of medieval life. Bread as timekeeper. Life in the ancient and medieval world didn't follow clock time. Clocks barely existed. Instead, life followed natural cycles, the sun, the seasons, the harvest, and the rhythms of hunger. Bread measured these rhythms. The day was divided by meals, and meals meant bread. You rose with the sun and ate bread. Around midday, you stopped work and ate bread. In the evening, as darkness fell, you ate bread again. Your stomach told you when it was time to eat, and bread was what you ate. For peasants working in the fields, the meals were simple. Bread and ale in the morning, providing calories to start the work. Bread and cheese or bread and onions at midday, eaten quickly in the field. Bread and pottage in the evening, a thick stew of vegetables and grains, with chunks of bread soaked in it. The week was measured by baking. Most households baked once a week, on a specific day. In medieval Europe, this was often Sunday, or sometimes Saturday in preparation for Sunday. The communal oven would be fired, and families would bring their dough. The smell of baking bread would fill the village, a weekly reassurance that life continued as it should. For the rest of the week, the bread from that baking had to suffice. It grew harder each day, less pleasant to eat, but still filling. By the 6th or 7th day, it was essentially a hardtack, needing to be soaked or broken into soups. The year was measured by harvests. In medieval England, the agricultural calendar was precise and inflexible. Wheat was planted in October or November after the autumn plowing. Through winter, the fields lay dormant, the seeds waiting in the frozen earth. In spring, the first green shoots appeared. By June, the wheat was tall and beginning to head. In late July and August, the wheat ripened and was harvested. This harvest was everything. If it succeeded, the village would have bread through the winter. If it failed, the village would starve. There was no backup plan. There were no emergency grain reserves for most people. The harvest was life or death. After harvest came threshing and winnowing, stretching through autumn and winter. Then storage, with the grain kept in barns or granaries, protected from rats and damp as best as possible. And then, slowly, day by day, week by week, meal by meal, that grain would be ground and baked and eaten until it was gone. And by then, you hoped, the next harvest was approaching. This cycle repeated endlessly. Planting, waiting, harvesting, storing, grinding, baking, eating, planting again. Each year the same. Each generation the same. For a medieval person, their life was measured in harvests. If you lived to be 48 years old, you had seen 48 harvests, 48 periods of frantic labor in late summer, 48 winters of eating harder and harder bread as the stores dwindled. Even festivals and holy days were tied to bread. Lammas Day, on August 1st, celebrated the first bread baked from new wheat. The name comes from loaf mass, a Christian blessing of the first loaf. This day marked the transition from old grain to new, from the anxious final months of last year's stores to the relief of a fresh harvest. Throughout the Christian calendar, bread held sacred significance. The Eucharist, the central ritual of medieval Christianity, transformed bread into the body of Christ. Every Sunday, peasants who ate coarse barley bread at home would receive a small wafer of fine wheat bread at church. This was the purest, whitest bread they would ever taste, reserved for the divine. During Lent, the 40 days before Easter, many people gave up fine bread and ate only the simplest varieties as a form of penance. This wasn't a great sacrifice for peasants who ate simple bread anyway, but for the wealthy, it was a genuine denial. Easter meant breaking the fast with fine breads, sometimes enriched with eggs and butter. Christmas meant special loaves. Saints' days might be celebrated with particular types of bread, each region having its own traditions. But these festivals were punctuation marks in a life otherwise defined by monotonous regularity. The special breads made the ordinary bread more visible by contrast. 99 days out of 100, you ate the same bread you'd eaten yesterday and would eat tomorrow. This regularity was the point. Bread was reliable. Bread was constant. Bread was what held a life together. The labor of bread. We've talked about the various stages of bread making. but it's worth pausing to consider the total labor involved. From planting to eating, bread consumed an enormous portion of human effort. An acre of medieval wheat might produce about 15 bushels of grain. After threshing and winnowing, that's perhaps 12 bushels of usable wheat. A bushel weighs about 60 pounds, so we're looking at 720 pounds of grain per acre. To plant that acre required plowing, which took at least a day with oxen. Seeding took hours. Weeding throughout the growing season might consume several days of work. Harvesting required a team of 5 people working at least a full day, usually more. Bundling and transporting the sheaves took more time. Threshing and winnowing stretched across weeks. Then came storage, which required building and maintaining granaries. Grinding the grain required hours every week. Baking required hours more. And all of this was to produce bread that would be consumed completely within a year, at which point the entire cycle would begin again. It's estimated that in medieval England, about half of all agricultural labor was devoted to grain production, and most of that grain became bread. Women bore much of this labor. Men did most of the plowing and harvesting, though women helped with harvest. But women did virtually all of the grinding and all of the baking. They also did most of the weeding, most of the gleaning, collecting leftover grain from the fields after harvest, and much of the threshing. A woman's day, in many medieval households, was structured around bread production. Rise early, grind grain for an hour or two, prepare the dough while it rises, attend to other tasks, spinning, weaving, tending children, feeding animals, maintaining the garden, shape the loaves, bake, clean, prepare the next meal, grind more grain. And through it all, the constant knowledge that this work would have to be repeated tomorrow and the day after and the day after that. This labor was unpaid. It was simply expected. A wife's duty, a daughter's duty, the work that kept a family alive, rendered invisible by its very necessity. The physical toll was significant. Grinding grain developed powerful arms and shoulders, but also led to chronic back pain and knee problems. Baking meant working near hot fires in small, poorly ventilated spaces. In summer, this was almost unbearable. Burns were common. Smoke inhalation was constant. And yet, this work had to be done. There was no alternative. No one could hire it out, except perhaps the very wealthy. No one could skip a day because they were tired. The family needed bread. Every day, without fail, this grinding, daily repetition is perhaps the truest face of ancient and medieval life. Not the excitement of tournaments or the drama of wars, but the simple, exhausting necessity of making bread, again and again and again in times of crisis. The centrality of bread to daily life meant that anything that disrupted bread production was catastrophic. Poor harvests were common. The medieval climate was unpredictable. A wet summer could rot the grain in the field. A drought could shrivel it before it ripened. Early frost could kill young plants. Late frost could damage mature wheat. Plant diseases could spread through a crop. Locusts could descend and devour everything. When the harvest failed, bread prices rose immediately. For people who bought their bread, this meant hunger. A laborer might spend half his wages on bread in a normal year. In a bad year, he might spend 3/4 of his wages on bread. And the bread he got would be lower quality, mixed with beans or chestnuts or anything that could stretch the dwindling grain supplies. For people who grew their own grain, a failed harvest meant dipping into seed grain, the grain that was supposed to be saved for next year's planting. This created a terrible choice. Eat now and have nothing to plant, or save the seed and starve before spring. The Great Famine of 1315, the 1317 shows how bad things could get. Heavy rains across northern Europe ruined harvests 2 years in succession. Grain stores were depleted. Bread became scarce and expensive. Chronicles report that people ate dogs, cats, rats. They made bread from tree bark and roots. In cities, the poor died in the streets. This was not ancient history. This was the early 14th century, in what was supposedly a prosperous age. And it was caused simply by too much rain at the wrong time. Bread, the reliable center of life, vanished. And without it, social order collapsed. Even in better times, the end of winter was always difficult. The harvest was 6 months past. The stored grain was running low. The flour had been ground and reground, getting coarser as the supplies dwindled. By March and April, many families were eating bread mixed with peas or beans, anything to stretch the grain until the spring greens could be foraged and a new harvest could come in. Historians call this the hungry gap, the period between the old year's stores running out and the new year's food becoming available. It was a yearly crisis, predictable and unavoidable. People lost weight. They grew weak. Children cried from hunger. And all they could do was wait and hope the next harvest would be better. Bread also played a role in urban crises. Medieval cities were volatile places. The urban poor depended entirely on purchased bread. If the price spiked or supplies were interrupted, riots could break out within days. The bread riot was a recognized form of social protest. Crowds would gather, demanding that authorities lower the price of bread or force bakers to sell at fair rates. Sometimes these riots turned violent. Bakeries were burned. Grain stores were looted. The authorities would respond with force, but they also understood the legitimacy of complaint. Everyone agreed that people needed bread. If bread became unaffordable, the social contract was broken. Bakers themselves were heavily regulated in medieval towns. They couldn't charge whatever they wanted. The authorities set official prices based on the cost of grain. They set official weights. A loaf had to weigh a certain amount. Inspectors would visit bakeries to ensure compliance. Bakers who short-weighted their loaves or used inferior grain could be fined or put in the pillory. The famous assize of bread in medieval England was a complex table that calculated how much bread a baker should produce from a given amount of flour at a given price. If wheat cost 6 shillings a quarter, the baker had to sell loaves of a specific weight and could not charge more than the specified price. If wheat rose to 7 shillings, the weight of the loaf decreased proportionally or the price rose, but not both. This regulation recognized that bread was too important to leave to market forces alone. It was literally the staff of life, the thing people leaned on. And if that staff broke, society itself would break. Bread and religion. We've already mentioned the Eucharist, but bread's religious significance went deeper than any single ritual. In the ancient world, bread was often used as an offering to gods. In Egypt, loaves of bread were left in tombs for the deceased to eat in the afterlife. Temples received daily offerings of bread, which the priests would consume after presenting it to the gods. In ancient Greece, cakes of barley bread were offered to the gods at festivals. The gods, it was believed, consumed the essence of the offering, leaving the physical bread to be eaten by worshippers. In ancient Israel, the temple in Jerusalem had a table for the showbread, 12 loaves representing the 12 tribes of Israel. These loaves were replaced every Sabbath, and the old loaves were eaten by the priests. Christianity intensified this sacred association. Jesus called himself the bread of life. He taught his followers to pray for daily bread. At the Last Supper, he broke bread and said, "This is my body." For medieval Christians, the Eucharist was not symbolic. They believed the bread literally became Christ's flesh through the miracle of transubstantiation. This created a paradox. The most common, most ordinary food became the most sacred object in their religion. The bread you ate for breakfast was mundane. The bread you received at Mass was divine. This may have made the daily bread more sacred by association, or it may have made the sacred bread more comprehensible. Either way, bread was caught between the earthly and the divine. Monasteries and convents structured their lives around bread. The rule of Saint Benedict, which governed many medieval religious communities, specified exactly how much bread each monk or nun should receive daily. 1 pound of bread per person per day, along with a drink and a portion of cooked food. This ration was meant to sustain a life of prayer and labor without excess. Monasteries often ran their own mills and bakeries, striving for self-sufficiency. Some became famous for the quality of their bread. The monks had time, resources, and motivation to perfect the craft. They weren't baking for profit, but for their own consumption and the glory of God. They also distributed bread as charity. Feeding the poor was a Christian duty, and bread was what you fed them. Monasteries might maintain a dole, where every day a certain number of loaves were given to the poor at the gate. This was practical charity. Bread kept people alive, but it was also spiritual. By feeding the hungry, you fed Christ himself. In Judaism, bread held similar significance. The Sabbath was welcomed with 2 loaves of challah, representing the double portion of manna that fell before the Sabbath in the desert. Passover was marked by unleavened bread, matzah, remembering the hasty departure from Egypt when there was no time to let bread rise. Islam, too, gave bread sacred status. Wasting bread was sinful. Bread that fell on the ground should be kissed and lifted up. Bread was a gift from God, not to be treated lightly. Across cultures and religions, bread occupied a space between the physical and the spiritual. It was both the most ordinary thing and the most sacred. The daily and the bread line, continuity across centuries. One of the most striking aspects of bread's history is how little it changed. The bread eaten by a peasant in medieval England would be recognizable to a farmer in ancient Mesopotamia. The process was the same. The tools were similar. The result was comparable. There were innovations, certainly. The rotary quern improved on the saddle quern. Water mills and windmills improved on hand grinding. Wheat varieties were slowly bred to be more productive. Baking techniques were refined. But the fundamentals remained unchanged for thousands of years. Plant grain, wait, harvest, grind, mix with water, bake, eat. This continuity reflects something essential about bread. It's a technology that reached a stable form very early and didn't need to evolve much. It worked. It kept people alive. Why change it? It also reflects the conservatism of agricultural societies. When your survival depends on grain, you don't experiment lightly. You plant what your father planted, in the way your father planted it. You grind and bake the way your mother did. Innovation is risky. Tradition is safe. But this continuity also created a shared experience across vast spans of time and space. A Roman soldier on Hadrian's Wall, a Byzantine baker in Constantinople, and a French peasant in the Loire Valley would all recognize each other's bread. They might prefer wheat over barley or leaven over unleavened, but the basic reality was the same. They all knew the weight of a full grain sack, the scratch of chaff against skin during harvest, the rhythmic scrape of stone on stone while grinding, the warmth of a baking fire, the smell of bread fresh from the oven, the dense, chewy texture of the interior, the thick, hard crust, the way a hunk of bread filled your stomach and gave you strength for the next task. This shared experience created a common language. When medieval people spoke of bread, they all knew what it meant, not in an abstract sense, but in a deeply physical sense. They had all made bread or watched it being made. They had all eaten it day after day. This is harder for us to grasp now. Most of us have never ground grain. Many have never baked bread from scratch. We buy bread wrapped in plastic, uniform and soft, from a store. We might eat bread one day and pasta the next and rice the day after. We have choices. For most of human history, there were no choices. There was bread, or there was taste of daily bread. Let's be specific about what ancient and medieval bread actually tasted like, because this is where the reality diverges most from our modern expectations. Most bread was sour. The sourdough fermentation that leavened it produced lactic acid and acetic acid, giving the bread a tangy, slightly vinegary taste. This was normal. This was what bread tasted like. Most bread was also somewhat bitter, especially if made from barley or rye. These grains have stronger flavors than wheat. They don't have a mild, slightly sweet taste of white flour. The texture was coarse. You could feel the grain, the bits of bran, and sometimes fragments of husk that weren't completely removed during milling. And sometimes you could taste grit, literal stone dust from the grinding process. Fresh bread had a substantial crust, not the delicate, flaky crust of modern baguette, but a thick, hard shell that you had to tear with your hands or bite through with strong teeth. The interior was dense and chewy, not light and airy. Stale bread became progressively harder. By the third or fourth day, it was difficult to bite into. By the end of a week, it was essentially rock hard. But it didn't mold quickly, thanks to the acids from fermentation and the thick crust that protected the interior. There was usually no butter, no jam, no honey to spread on it. Those were luxuries. Most people ate bread plain, or used it to soak up soup and stew. The bread itself was a food, not the vehicle for other foods. Salt, when it was included, made a significant difference. It enhanced the flavor of the grain and made the bread more palatable. But salt was expensive in many regions and was often omitted. Some breads were flavored with herbs or seeds. Cumin, caraway, fennel seeds, or poppy seeds might be mixed into the dough. But again, this was optional and depended on what was available. The overriding flavor, though, was grain. Each grain had its distinctive taste. Wheat was mild and slightly nutty. Barley was more assertive, with bitter undertones. Rye was sour and earthy. Oats were bland but wholesome. And mixed grain breads combined these flavors in unpredictable ways. If you could taste ancient or medieval bread today, you might not recognize it as bread. It would seem too sour, too coarse, too heavy. It would require real chewing, real jaw strength. Your modern palate, accustomed to soft, sweet, white bread, might reject it. But to people who ate it daily, it was normal. It was comfort. It was home. The smell of baking bread was a smell of safety, of survival, of continuity. The end of ancient bread. When did the bread we've been describing finally change? When did ancient bread become modern bread? The transition was gradual, spanning several centuries. But several key developments marked the shift. The first was the commercialization of baking. By the late Middle Ages, in cities and large towns, bread baking was increasingly done by professional bakers rather than at home. This standardization improved consistency, but also disconnected people from the process. You no longer knew the person who ground your grain or baked your bread. You just bought it. The second was the rise of white bread as an aspiration, and eventually a standard. For centuries, white bread was an expensive luxury. But as milling techniques improved and trade networks expanded, white flour became more available. By the 18th century, even working people in cities were demanding white bread, seeing it as a sign of progress and civilization. The third was the industrialization of milling. The invention of the roller mill in the 19th century made it possible to produce pure white flour efficiently and cheaply. The mill could separate the endosperm from the bran and germ with precision, something hand mills and stone mills could never do perfectly. The fourth was the use of commercial yeast. For thousands of years, bread was leavened with sourdough starter or beer barm, both of which required maintenance and produced unpredictable results. In the 19th century, commercial yeast became available. It was consistent, reliable, and easy to use. It also changed the flavor of bread, making it blander and less sour. The fifth was the addition of sugar. Modern bread recipes often include sugar to feed the yeast and to make the bread taste sweeter. Ancient and medieval bread was never sweet. The addition of sugar was a modern innovation, reflecting changing taste preferences. And finally, the mechanization of baking itself. The electric oven, the mechanical mixer, the ability to control temperature precisely. All of these made bread baking easier and more consistent, but they also removed it further from the handcrafted, variable product it had been for millennia. By the 20th century, in industrialized countries, bread had become a mass-produced commodity. Soft, white, uniform, sliced, wrapped in plastic, and available every day in every store. It was cheap and abundant in ways that would have been unimaginable to medieval people. But something was lost. The bread no longer tasted of the specific grain from the specific field. It no longer carried the marks of the individual baker's hands. It no longer varied from day to day or season to season. It was consistent, which was the goal. But that consistency erased the particularity that had defined bread for so long. Quiet reflection. For thousands of years, most human lives were lived one loaf at a time. The day began with bread. It continued with bread. It ended with bread. The year turned around the harvest. The week turned around the baking. Life itself was measured in loaves consumed and loaves yet to be made. This was not a dramatic story. There were no heroes in the daily baking of bread. No great victories. No tragic defeats. Just a slow, patient, repetitive work of survival. A woman waking before dawn to grind grain. The rhythmic scrape of stone on stone in the half-light. The dough mixed and kneaded and left to rise while other tasks were done. The fire built and tended until the heat was right. The loaves shaped and placed to bake. The smell of baking filling the house. The bread turned out, the crust hard and hot. The knowledge that tomorrow it would all need to be done again. A man in the field, planting seeds in the cold earth of early spring, watching the shoots appear, praying for rain, then praying for sun, seeing the wheat grow tall and golden, cutting it down with a sickle, arms aching, back screaming, bundling it, carrying it, threshing it, all for grain that would become flour, that would become bread, that would be eaten and forgotten. Children who helped with the weeding, or carried water to the field, or turned the upper stone of the quern until their arms burned, who learned by watching their parents, and who would teach their own children the same tasks in the same way. This was the substance of life. Not the events we remember from history books, the wars and the coronations and the great building projects, but the quiet, unrecorded daily rhythm of labor and eating and sleep. Bread held it all together. Bread was the constant, the reliable, the necessary. Bread was what you could count on, assuming the harvest didn't fail, and the miller didn't cheat you, and the Lord's oven keeper didn't demand too high a fee. Most days, bread was there. Most years, there was enough. And on the days and years when there wasn't, the absence of bread meant the absence of hope. To understand the ancient and medieval world, you have to understand the centrality of bread, not as a romantic symbol, not as a quaint historical detail, but as a physical, daily, demanding reality. Bread structured time. Bread structured society. Bread structured life itself. And for all those centuries, for all those millions of lives, bread was made by hand. slowly, imperfectly, patiently, one loaf at a time. The great stone mills still turned year after year, grinding grain. The communal ovens still heated, week after week, baking loaves. The fields still grew golden in late summer, waiting for harvest. The cycle continued, unchanging, reliable, essential. For the people who lived these lives, bread was not an artifact of history. It was not a subject for contemplation. It was simply there, part of the landscape of existence, as unquestioned as breathing. They woke. They ground grain. They mixed dough. They baked bread. They ate. They slept. They woke again. And the bread was there, always there, marking each day, each meal, each moment of their lives. Ordinary, repetitive, unremarkable, and absolutely essential. That is the story of daily bread in the ancient and medieval world. Not heroic, not exciting, just real, just true, just the way most people lived, most of the time, for most of human history. The bread has been baked. The bread has been eaten. And tomorrow, it will all begin again. If you enjoyed learning about the quiet, essential rhythms of bread in daily life in the ancient and medieval world, please consider liking this video and subscribing to Dreamy Hours for more relaxing explorations of history. Thank you for spending this time with me, and may your own bread, whatever form it takes, be plentiful and nourishing. Good night.